I don't know how you want to handle it, but shall I just walk through? And I figured I'd just step to you guys or turn over to you when there were your slides, or either just feel free to speak up. Sound good?
Yeah, we'll just
Definitely.
chime in.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Perfect. All right, everybody, thank you for joining us. Thank you for listening in about something about redistricting. We're always glad to have new people hear about redistricting. It's not the most appealing or sexiest topic, but we like it. So Nebraska is redistricting. Where I like to start is an explanation of what are districts. When we're talking about redistricting, we're talking about redrawing our voting maps. And these are the voting maps. So this is the legislative districts in our state. So these are your senators, your state senators. There are 49 of them. And this is the current layout. This year, in 2021, we'll be redrawing this map. We'll be moving these districts to account for population shifts due to population shifts and because of the census. We use census data to redraw this. This is the other map that's most relevant. We're talking about redistricting. This is the House of Representatives. We'll also be redrawing this map to account for shifts in population. Brad, John, anything you guys want to add at this point?
Oh, I would just chime in how you're talking about, we are going to be recreating these maps due to those population changes. And that was something I really enjoyed working on, was Civic Nebraska census work as part of Nebraska Counts. That's really where a lot of the nonprofit effort went into getting out the count. And that we'll see will play a huge role in not just funding, but in creating these new maps. And for everybody who participated in that process and completing their census, for their voice to really count and for them to really be counted in that population, it's super, super key that we have a good redistricting process paired with that census data. Now that we have been able to hopefully try and get some pretty accurate census data for Nebraska.
Yeah, and I would just add that we are not anticipating that we're going to add or lose any representation in the House of Reps, which was a really huge concern for some other states during the census process. And that's just one thing to add in.
For sure. All right, moving on. I'd like to give you a little oversight of the Nebraska process of redistricting and how we're kind of unique. So in Nebraska, like every other state, not unique, every 10 years, you're following the census, we redraw these maps. In Nebraska, though, unlike some other states, we have our state legislators redraw the maps. A 9-member committee of state senators is put together in the year we redistrict. This committee was just put together a couple weeks ago and finalized for the redrawing this year. How we determine is it's 3 senators from each congressional district, and there's a required 5-4 partisan split that's leaning towards the side of the last gubernatorial winner. So other states do not necessarily use their state senators to draw. They use committees, they use other mechanisms. We'll get into that later, but Nebraska is unique in that we're a one house and that redraws our own districts. Our state senators do that. So right now, a benefit is there are public hearings in every congressional district. That is required by law. So there is public input that's in the rules. At the end of the day, though, the governor does have veto power. So there's a lot of work between the governor and the legislature in drawing these maps. Brad, John, anything about Nebraska redistricting you want to add?
Not specifically about Nebraska redistricting, but I do want to add there are those public hearings, but we have state senators and the governor there to represent us at all times. So don't feel bound to only make your voice heard about redistricting and these maps in those hearings. Definitely make noise about redistricting and wanting to see an independent process all the time, and be reaching out to your state senators and to the governor, because that's how we can get to a good process here in Nebraska.
The senators on the committee, Senators Blood, Breezy, Brewer, Geist, Lathrop, and Linehan. And also Lowe, Moorfeld, and Wayne.
Thank you, John. Both of you. Oh, moving on. This is the Civic Nebraska wheelhouse, census and redistricting. I will drop us onto the next page and give what I've got, but you guys know way more about this stuff. So why don't you actually just take it away? Brad, tell us about census.
Yeah, so like I was saying earlier, the census is really just a great opportunity. It really pairs well with voting, as far as the opportunity to be able to have your voice heard. And that census data will be being released in July. It took a lot of work to get the count here in Nebraska as high as we got it. Nebraska, in self-response, people completed the census themselves. We came in fourth place by the end of the process. So we had a lot of Nebraskans making sure they were completing the census and completing it accurately. And that's the big thing about self-response, is that you're not having your neighbor complete the census for you, which is if the Census Bureau keeps trying to reach you and they don't ever get to you, they start doing things like that, like asking your neighbor, hey, about how many people live there. And that's not what we want. We want an accurate count of the number of people living here in Nebraska, so that everyone is able to be represented. So that's really how the census plays in. It's just an opportunity for communities to build power, to bring funding into their community, and to have the state legislature reflect them.
Yeah, and looking at the history of the census in the United States, it's just such an incredibly important process that happens just once every 10 years. This was a bit of an innovation in how countries govern and also choose their representation and where people are going to have their voices heard. And ever since we implemented this in the 1700s, every 10 years something changes, things are modified. And it has led all the way to the point where this last census was the very first time that all of us could go online to complete it through questionnaires there. And that was widely successful because a lot of people used it, and that saved a lot of resources in terms of having to go to people's houses and knock on their doors. But that being said, there's still a lot of areas in the state where the counting wasn't the greatest, which we anticipated that. There was some really good estimates on where low response rates were going to be, and that's where we focused a lot of our get out the count efforts, and it really paid off in a big way. So it's a good thing that going into this redistricting process, we know we have good data and we didn't have a wildly off count census. So all those things are going to bode very well for us moving forward in the preceding months.
Gavin, you're muted, man.
Gavin, you're muted.
I know I'm someone's grandpa. I'm muted. Sorry. I am muted. I unmuted now. Moving to flaws in the process. I feel like it's important to touch on some of the flaws in the redistricting process in general when we're being honest about it, especially when we're going to talk about reform. So this is just an image I love. It explains gerrymandering very, very well, in the sense that looking at this image on your left-hand side here, there are 50 precincts, right, in an area. So you split an area into 50 precincts, and normally 60% of those are blue and 40% of them are red, just by how they are. But then how you draw the districts matters. Here, if we draw 5 districts of those 50 precincts, look, we can have blue win every single time. On the other, draw 5 districts again, and it matters how you draw it. You either get majority red, majority blue, which goes to show that it doesn't the layout of the people, the number of count of the people in an area actually can be skewed using the gerrymandering process. So the common problems here are district maps are drawn to the advantage of political parties. We see this red, blue all across the nation. That districts are drawn to favor whoever the majority is. That's usually the situation. The redistricting process, it also fails to take into account where people actually live. When it is a process of drawing lines, of securing political power, we forget it can be forgotten where neighborhoods actually are and that they're continuous. You see this in the districts. We don't have many of these in Nebraska, but a lot of states have these long meandering districts that might look like snakes. Some of the more egregious examples you've seen. They don't actually think about where people live and how they congregate, how they vote. Finally, elected officials can draw maps when they're in charge to retain incumbent control. There is, with the ability to draw their own maps, incumbents have the ability to retain control over what their districts look like. They can shift a district one street over in either direction and either drop voters that don't agree with them or gain voters that do. It's a process that's been used basically throughout our entire history of America to retain incumbent control and political power. But there is upsides, and there are ways we as people can take it back. Before we jump to that, Brad, John, anything you want to add on the problem side of this?
I would just say with the problem side, the problem is getting worse because of technology and the accuracy at which computers are really able to draw a district to do a certain thing, not just for the current year it's being drawn in, but drawn out so that that district will stay that way over the course of the whole 10 years until the next census data. So that's something I would definitely highlight, is just the fact that it's a little bit different when it's somebody just trying to eyeball it and like, I don't think they'll vote for me. I think they may. But when you're really using that demographic data at such a deep level and doing projections with it, it can really just throw our democracy out of whack.
That's exactly right, Brad. And Gavin mentioned this, but by the second census that took place in the United States, we already had the issue of gerrymandering political districts for incumbents to retain control. And now it's, like Brad was saying, even worse because we have algorithms where we can just tell them, hey, I want to figure out 10 different scenarios where I always win for them, based on odds and demographic information. And the machine is going to, punch out that information, and it just makes the job a lot easier on the part of nefarious actors. So, but technology, while it could also hurt us, it can also really help us through this process. And it is, of course, something we're not going to be able to keep out of how we do redistricting. It would be insane to, not rely on some of those technologies. But there's a lot of opportunities for making sure the same algorithms that could really plague this process will make it even more fair and transparent moving forward.
For sure. You make a good point there. It's about how we use that technology, because the technology should be put to use for the public interest, right? We'd all agree to that. But there are also people who would gladly use it in the opposite direction. So yeah, keeping that in mind. So potential reforms. How can we improve the redistricting process? I was going to let you guys start by talking through nonpartisan redistricting, the movement there, and give us some background on that.
After you, Brad.
All right, cool. Nonpartisan redistricting, why it matters. I've already touched on this a little bit, but it's really because it means fair representation. It means that people are having a legislature that looks like the people, and it affects what issues are being brought up. If you have a community that's split into 4 or 5 different districts so that their political power is diluted, their issues are probably going to come up less. So it really makes a difference with that. And then also, when we don't have a nonpartisan way of going about it, you can really just use redistricting to not only make a district more friendly to you, but totally cut out your opponents. You can draw a district so that someone who is up and coming and has been looking at running and planning on running in a district, you can just draw them out of a district. And that's just not the way things should be. People should elect their politicians. This system, when it's not being done in a nonpartisan way, it's just politicians picking who's voting for them. And really, it just comes down to the fact that it hurts the people of Nebraska, as well as hurting our legislature, and just that nonpartisan nature. When districts are being drawn in such a partisan way, there is that you lose that ability to compromise. That's why you kind of see a lot more partisan split, because there's not those same districts where, you know, half the time it's going one way and half the time it's going the other. A lot of districts can become, okay, this is a guaranteed seat this way and this is a guaranteed seat that way. And that's not how the game is supposed to be played. So it's up to us to make sure it's done right.
I don't have anything to add to that. Brad covered that one really well.
Good deal. Well, here's some quick facts you guys provided. You want to hit on any of these, Brad? John?
I think John wants to. This looks more like lawyery stuff, so I'll let him handle it.
Yeah, absolutely. So the courts in redistricting have had a pretty complicated relationship, is one way to summarize it. There is really no remedy for a state or the citizenry of a state to go forward and try and reverse really bad gerrymandering and political maps. That's been tried and has been kind of slapped down by the Supreme Court in recent memory. There are some older cases where there were maps that had to be redrawn, but because it was just proven to be so blatantly racist or partisan, those are the types of things you need to be able to demonstrate before you can really find some relief from a court. So that's not really something we're going to be able to rely on here if things go south. So we really need to get it right to begin with. Both the congressional and state legislative districts are going to be drawn by the state legislature. So the common thing that we say in this area is that we should be picking our elected officials. Our elected officials should not be choosing us, who they're going to represent. And anytime we give the keys to the kingdom, in a sense, to politicians who are going to have some measure of say in how they are going to govern their districts, or what districts are even going to govern to begin with, that's a very nervous prospect, because of course they're going to act in their own self-interest, such as human nature. So how do we implement things and safeguards to help alleviate some of those issues? Because at the end of the day, even though this might appear like a partisan issue, no matter what party affiliation, this is overall just bad for business and bad for the democratic experiment. And it's going to result in really just less representation for your side overall. Even if you are part of a member of a majority party that's doing packing and cracking of legislative districts, it's ultimately just will be reversed in some sense or another by another party if they take control. So we don't want to really leave that up to partisan whims. We want to be able to have the Nebraskans in our state be counted in a way, and in a very accurate way. And after they're counted, put in districts that make sense based on the geography and the culture of their neighborhoods and those types of considerations. The one kind of guideline we have from the Nebraska Constitution on how we have to draw legislative districts is that they must be continuous and compact, and they keep to county boundaries whenever practicable, right? And the whenever practicable part is problematic, because what's whenever practicable for one person could be very different for another. So oftentimes, while a lot of the counties we see are intact, there are areas in the state where there's these crazy little salamander tails dipping into another county. And that is, should raise eyebrows anytime you see something like that in a map. And things we want to avoid. And the other consideration for during this process, just to bring up real briefly, is the effect it's having on the rural-urban divide. And as we all know, in the rural parts of the state, they are losing a lot of people in population, and that results in less representation, less state senators. The last redistricting process was not very good to the western side of the state, and based on depopulation for the year 2020, it's probably going to be a very similar situation. So this also results in some senators covering just absolutely vast stretches of territory. Like Senator Brewer, for example, the amount of counties and just square miles he covers as a state senator is equal to some countries. It's absolutely vast amounts of areas, and that makes it harder for constituents to be able to travel to the senator or have an interaction with the senator at some point. And if that's the case, then people are losing out that direct representation.
At this point, I figured we could usually talk about a few reforms or what is possible. So we've talked about what the redistricting process is and some of the big problems in the redistricting process, especially in a model like Nebraska. As organizations, we have both advocated for big changes to the Nebraska system. Primary among them is an independent commission model. That is something I think both Common Cause and Civic Nebraska would agree would be a good move for Nebraska. Now, what is an independent commission? An independent commission is, instead of having your state legislators, instead of having elected officials draw your map, you are having independent citizens draw your map. You are having people who apply to take part in the process draw the map. This is happening in states like Colorado, Arizona, Missouri, and it's actually quite a growing trend in the redistricting movement to take the power away from elected officials and instead invest it in a group of citizens who want to do it, who have interest in the process. The other option would be an Iowa state staff model. In Iowa, there's actual not elected, but state staff members who draw the maps. They draw all the maps. We have something similar in Nebraska in that we have a research office that helps state senators draw the maps. In Iowa, that research office is solely responsible for drawing the maps. And so it does take it out of the hands of elected officials in large part. But at the end of the day, they still vote on the maps. They still have oversight on what the process looks like. Brad, John, anything about independent commission or Iowa's model you want to say before? I think we have more to say about LB 107 and
Well, I would just say with the independent commission, that is something that there does need to be guidelines on who is on that independent commission. So when you're looking at independent commission legislation, that's something just for you to keep in mind. And then with the Iowa state staff model, from what I've heard, it's incredible the way Iowa does it. People love their system. I've also heard it would be really hard to replicate because they moved to that system before redistricting became as partisan as it is now. It's always had a partisan role, but they moved to that system at a time where it wasn't as divided as we are now. So those are two drawbacks I always see. But then I look at Nebraska system, which is neither of any of the benefits that come from either of those systems. So really any improvements we can make is great because we're really at a point where we just have the bare minimum. Like, you can't be the worst person in the world when you're creating this map, and you can't be super racist. And that's about as much guidelines as we have for people in drawing the maps. So yeah, any system is an improvement. And So I'm excited for LB 107. I'm also excited to see ways that it can become a larger, more powerful change to the system.
The current framework for how we do redistricting here in the unicameral is they implement their own rules, and those rules in place, that's really it. So I think it is very important for us as we the people, the second house of the government here in Nebraska, to be able to put forward a solution such as LB 107 and attempt to have some say in the issue. Otherwise, I don't think we can necessarily trust our elected officials to fair and balanced job every time.
Cool. And I can, Gavin,
Please.
did you want to talk more about 107, or I saw you switch to this slide?
You know what? You've got some good stuff here. So why don't you start? And then there's another one. We'll just go back and forth on LB 107. You start us.
Cool. Well, I'll let you go into more of the details on the actual bill. But the one thing I will point out to everyone on this call is that there will be a hearing for LB 107. It'll be on Wednesday, this upcoming Wednesday, the 17th. It'll be at 12 p.m. In room 1525. So if redistricting is something you're interested in, and even if it's not, still come up and testify to support this bill, because it will help preserve our democracy. So we all need to step up and take action on it.
Yeah, it's coming up fast. So if you're interested, please be ready. But let me tell you why you should be interested. So LB 107, this was brought by Senator McAllister as a step forward for Nebraska. It's not a perfect system. It is in most part retaining the system we already have as a state, but moving from, as John mentioned, only being in the rules of the legislature to statute instead. So that provides greater public notice, public hearing requirements. It also gives us greater legal protections in the actual carrying out of redistricting. So LB 107 top line improvements, it will require public access and input. So it explicitly states the number of hearings that will be held for the maps that are eventually drawn. It also gives public access to the documents and the maps that this committee will be working with. Right now, those requirements are only in the rules and can be changed fairly easily by the legislature. Another big, I would say quite important part of LB 107 is that it forbids using voting data, political affiliation, or general demographic data from being used when drawing maps. That means they can't go into the software we talked about and select by party registration. That data exists out there somewhere. They could get access to it, but this bill would forbid them from being able to draw maps where they're looking at voting data. How did you vote last year? They could sort by that, or they could sort by, like I said, political affiliation. Forbidding those would move us forward in how we draw the maps. It would be using a more pure data set, if you will, one not biased by political voting or affiliations. So great, important part of that bill. The last, and I would say this is another big important part of this bill, it only allows for small changes to the district maps that are drawn by the research office. So that first set of mostly unbiased, mostly good voting districts can only be shifted here and there. In the last redistricting process, entirely different, entirely changed maps could be introduced at any point and were. There were a broad set of maps from a broad set of sources. This would make sure that senators are only making corrective amendments to maps instead of creating maps from just a whole cloth that better serve their interests. Brad, John, anything else about LB 107 that you think is worth noting?
I think you got it.
The last thing I want to take some time to talk about is an initiative that Common Cause, Civic Nebraska, and other nonprofits are working on. And this is a public engagement, public information side of redistricting work. It's called community mapping. The idea is, as advocates, to go into the communities we're in and speak with them about what the geographic boundaries that they see within their community. So go to a neighborhood and say, where are the streets, where are the landmarks that define your neighborhood? And then to do that throughout Lincoln, throughout Omaha, and in as many rural areas as we can, to bring together a set of maps, a set of not districts per se, but just of communities that we can give to the legislature, to give to the redistricting committee, so they're not cutting neighborhoods in half, so that ideally these, what we call communities of interest, are first and foremost represented in the redistricting process, instead of it being about shifting gigantic demographic chunks in software, but giving people the ability to have a say in the redistricting process that really is barred to most simply because who's going to the redistricting hearings. Most people don't have the time or the knowledge or the faith in themselves to do it, right? So how do we connect people with the process and get them engaged?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. This community mapping process is really what redistricting should look like from the jump. This should be the whole process. It should be a community saying like, hey, this is us. We want someone to represent us, who we consider us, our community, versus communities being dictated to and being told, no, this is your community, this is where that community ends. It doesn't make sense. And, it's just community mapping will just improve our democracy.
Yeah, and just one thing to add there, the whole campaign behind the census in this year, there was just a great sense of communities banding together and everybody coming together during a very divisive 2020 election to at least agree that it is good to count all of us and to make sure that we're going to have an idea of where people are living for the next 10 years that'll dictate all these government programs and where resources, and then how the maps are going to be drawn. If that same kind of energy and sense of community and level of activity and action by people living inside, our state goes through and carries on into the redistricting process, it's only going to yield better things for us for the next 10 years.
Well put. That is where my presentation ends, but maybe we can transition over to, unless you guys have something more, we could transition over to questions. Be happy to take anything we've got.
Yeah, we have a couple questions. If anyone else has questions, please put them in the question and answer and we will get to them now. One person would like to know, can the governor veto the whole thing or just pieces of it?
The whole thing. It's usually done as there may be, and I might be wrong, there may be instances in the past where he's done one set of maps and not another, or he or she, I guess I should say. But yes, it's a whole veto.
Okay. And then just a few slides ago, we had a question about what are considered technical errors in this context. Yeah.
It's a good question. And it's that will always be argued. Technical errors, I would argue the technical errors are this street is an alley or this is a block over, maybe at most. Using technical errors is being exclusionary to things that are preference based. I think the goal here is it just needs to be shifted this much instead of a lot. But yeah, it's a good question.
And in my mind, another technical area would be they input some data, they get some maps back, and then they take a look at the population of some of the districts and they see Senator A their population somehow ended up being only like 15,000 people. And then Senator B, maybe their district was 30,000 people. That would be a pretty huge technical error, because as close as we can get it, there should be pretty equal population per state senator in terms of their territory.
Thank you. What, if anything, would you like from people for grassroots actions?
I would definitely say come up to the hearing. If you don't feel comfortable coming to testify in person, submit some written testimony. You can also email in testimony, and that'll be on the 17th. But again, this is going to be a long process. This is going to be a process where we will need grassroots action every day from now until the maps are finalized and signed. So, you know, call your state senator, and then once you've called your state senator, call the other 48 others, call the governor, advocate, and talk to them about the things you saw in this presentation that concern you about the process if it's not independent and done in a nonpartisan way. And I would just emphasize, when you're doing it, the idea that Nebraska, we are supposed to be this nonpartisan state with a unicameral, and us, the people, being that other house. So we really need to take that power and make sure the legislature is lining up and showing that they also believe in that Nebraskan value.
Perfect. The only thing I would add is that in talking, referencing back to the community mapping stuff, we are currently looking for partners in every shape and form. We're talking with neighborhood associations, considering maybe faith communities. How do we get into Nebraska, into those areas? If this is an issue where you want to get grassroots community members involved, Common Cause has an organizer right now dedicated to this work. So get in contact with, you can please, if your organization's interested, get in contact with me at I'll have them send out the details. I don't have to do that now. But know that there's organizing going on around this, and there are opportunities for you to get involved and plug your people into this work in a way that doesn't involve lobbying if you don't want to.
Yeah, and I would say finally, along with that, just tell a neighbor or a friend who may not know what the process is when they hear gerrymandering or hear redistricting. Just inform them about it. Talk to them about, hey, I know you did the census. This is the next step from the census to make sure that information that you gave the government is really put to the best use it can be.
Great. Kind of along with that, are there any social media campaigns going on right now, or will there be, that people can follow along and maybe share?
Don't you guys have something coming out, Brad?
We have a couple things coming, John. I don't know if you want to go into them more.
Sure. Yeah, we have one video on redistricting that it's about 45 seconds, minute long, that covers this issue in gerrymandering, and we're going to be pushing that on all our channels. So feel free to follow us at Civic Nebraska on our Facebook, or sign up to be a voting rights advocate, and you'll get alerts from us, Team Voting Rights, on all these issues and more. And we'll be dropping that information in the coming weeks here for everyone to share.
I will put if I'm assuming you three are okay if I put your emails in the follow-up email too, and then that way people can reach out directly if they have maybe more pointy questions. So, okay, we have two more questions. How will the state legislative seats be impacted? I thought our rural areas potentially losing numbers and seats.
Yes. So I've heard talk that rural areas will be losing 2 seats. Brad, John, have you guys, you're closer to the census, heard anything different?
No, I've heard about the same.
That's a number I've heard been kicked around before even the census concluded. So, I mean, we'll see. But that's, Omaha and Lincoln will pick up something, and then, that's got to come from somewhere. So it's going to be from west.
Okay, that is all of the questions I have right now. I'll turn it over to Joe.
Thanks so much, Hannah. Thank you, Brad and John and Gavin, for a really robust conversation about redistricting, and thank you all for being a part of it. We just want to give you, from the coalition standpoint, just a heads up about our next training in the winter public policy series. We're going to be doing a deeper dive into informing legislative advocacy. So if you're interested in learning about how to read a bill, how to read amendments, what to look for in the legislative journal that comes out every day, how to read a committee statement. So all of those things will help you better engage on bills that you're following in the legislative session. So that training is coming up February 22nd, again at noon, and in partnership with NAM. So we really hope you all will sign up and attend that training. And then we have decided to move the public student loan forgiveness training to later on, when we get a better sense from whatever the new administration is going to do in terms of addressing public student loan forgiveness. So keep an eye out for when we reschedule that training, but the next one will be informative legislative advocacy, which will be February 22nd, again at noon to 1. So thank you everybody for joining us this afternoon. And I hope you stay engaged in the legislative process, and particularly in redistricting, because it's so important for civic engagement across our state. So thanks everybody. Have a great afternoon.
Thanks everyone.
Thank you.